All right, welcome everyone. For session 10, I'm going to share a few thoughts to get things rolling here. I'll start with a kind of methodological point, and then I'm going to try to find some correspondences between what Steiner is sharing in this early account of Earth evolution and connect it to Genesis. But in terms of method, what is Steiner engaged in here? This is one of the themes I'm continually returning to. And I think of something Whitehead says in Process and Reality. He says, if we desire a record of uninterpreted experience, we must first ask a stone to record its autobiography. Every scientific memoir, in its record of the facts, is shot through and through with interpretation. So I think while Steiner is engaged in a kind of clairvoyant research or spiritual scientific research in an attempt to observe spiritual facts, supersensible facts, inevitably there's going to be some degree of interpretation involved. And so it makes it all the more important for us to attempt to develop our own capacity to make these sorts of observations ourselves so that we can see, well, what is fact and what is interpretation. And I think for most of us, while I'll speak for myself, I'm not yet in a position to make these observations myself. And so distinguishing fact from interpretation is difficult. But in some sense, Steiner is engaged precisely in an effort to ask a stone to record its autobiography. He's trying to recollect the process of evolutionary differentiation, whereby there could have become a stone, and not just a stone though. He wants to recollect the process of evolutionary differentiation, such that there could have come to be an I or ego observing a stone. And so, in other words, Steiner's account of evolution is an attempt to take the existence of self-conscious human beings seriously. Most of the attempts to provide an evolutionary explanation nowadays, these attempts do not take the existence of the human I seriously. They do not start with the facts of, freedom, wisdom, love, which are presuppositions for human beings to lead a moral life, a meaningful life. Most accounts of evolution from a materialistic point of view consider all of that to be sort of epiphenomenal, and they try to explain human life, human consciousness on the basis of the tumbling of stones, basically, to give some materialistic explanation in terms of atoms falling in the void. Now, Steiner's doing something different. He wants to take the existence of human self-consciousness seriously. And so initially, when we attempt to do something like that, we might think that the ego, that the human self-conscious being is the highest, while it is the highest part of ourselves now, we might think that it's the oldest. But Steiner says, no, actually our skeleton is the oldest. The stone, the physicality is the oldest. It goes back to old Saturn, right? And so in an attempt to see the connection between our physical nature and our ego, and also these subtler dimensions of our being, the astral and the etheric, Steiner goes through this process of recollection. And one of the things that becomes apparent when we try to understand our own self-consciousness as an integral part of the cosmos, and in some sense essential to the very meaning of this evolutionary process, we start to have to recognize that various phases of evolution are the result of the deeds of spiritual beings, and even the sacrifices of spiritual beings. And so when we go back to old Saturn, Steiner describes this sacrifice that the thrones, the spirits of will, engaged in, giving their substance to become the warmth of Saturn. And then in the sun phase of evolution, Steiner similarly describes the spirits of wisdom or the dominions giving themselves to produce what has become our etheric being. And then in the moon phase of evolution, the virtues or the spirits of motion giving themselves to become our astral being. And in the earth phase, Steiner describes the ego as a kind of gift from the sacrifice of the spirits of form, the exousiae. These exousiae are both the Elohim and Yahweh of the Old Testament, right? And so when Steiner describes during the earth phase of evolution the separation of the sun initially, higher beings go with the sun to avoid densifying and condensing too much on the earth, and then soon thereafter the moon separates from the earth, and that the moon and the sun engage in this attempt to balance the forces maturing the human being on the earth. Elsewhere, not in occult science, Steiner will talk about how Yahweh, as one of the exousiae, spirits of form, goes with the moon, whereas these other exousiae, the Elohim, remain with the sun. And so Yahweh is engaged with these sun beings in a balancing effort. But there's also, if we remember from prior sessions, the fall, the battle in heaven, which happens during the moon phase of evolution. And this recapitulates in some sense. And I want to try to draw a connection here to the Genesis account. It seems to me that while in each phase of planetary evolution, right, there's a recapitulation, a kind of fractal repetition of what has happened before. And Steiner describes these phases of 7. And in Genesis, we have the account of creation in 7 days. And I think Genesis, in some sense, can be read as a somewhat fuzzy but deeply esoteric account of Earth evolution, which again contains within it the fractal repetition of Saturn, Sun, and Moon. But let me just read the first couple of verses of Genesis, and we'll get a sense for, if we think of Genesis beginning on Sunday as the first day, Monday as the second day, I think we can see resonances with what Steiner is telling us here. So in the beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. So this seems to me, this first day seems to be describing the separation of the sun from the earth. Next, this is chapter 1, verse 6. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate the water from water, the waters above from the waters below." So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it, and it was so. God called the vault sky, and there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. Now it goes on like this, and on every other day, the first day, the third, fourth, fifth, after the next deed of creation has been undertaken, God saw that it was good. This doesn't happen on the second day. God does not say this was good. What's going on there? I've just been reading Carl Jung's answer to Job, and he actually remarks on this interesting fact. He says, the Creator, who found every other day of his work good, failed to give good marks to what happened on Monday. He simply said nothing, a circumstance that favors an argument from silence. So in answer to Job, Jung is talking about the way in which Yahweh, for some reason, is tempted by Satan, he says. And Jung actually mentions there's different dimensions of this satanic being, an harmonic dimension, a luciferic dimension. But Jung's not as clear about that differentiation as Steiner is. But it seems that Yahweh is in this debate with Satan and Lucifer, let's say, in Steiner's terms. And and that Lucifer is in some sense trying to speed up human evolution, right? And this separation of the moon, where Yahweh goes with it, leads to sexual differentiation among human beings on the earth, right? And Steiner will remark at this point that the capacity for external perception begins, and it seems somehow related to this new form of reproduction or fertilization, which involves this split into man and woman. And you can hear here, I think, some resonances with the story of Adam and Eve in the garden, and the serpent. And so I wanted to just throw this into the mix here, because I think these resonances are interesting, and that something like a fall is occurring on Monday, when, or Moon Day, when the moon is separating with Yahweh from the earth. So I think I'll leave it there. Oh, one more thing. Steiner introduces the diversity of races in this section as well, which I think is also related to the fall. It's a kind of account of the way in which human beings on the earth are distributed at different places on the earth, and that leads to the formation of the head and the limbs being different for different beings. Some of these human beings with a more perfect head seem to be able to recall the influence of the archai a little bit more clearly, whereas those with more developed limbs can only recall the activity of the archangels. And so there's this internal differentiation of the human community occurring at this stage, which, it shows how deeply Steiner's understanding of race on the earth goes in this account of creation. And I'm not sure what else to say about it other than to put that out on the table for us to discuss. Other human beings at this stage who can no longer incarnate in the densified earth, they end up going to Jupiter, going to Mars, some end up on Saturn. And so Steiner describes how as evolution proceeds on the earth, the number of human souls decreases on the earth. Yeah. So I'll stop there and invite some dialogue and conversation. Yeah, Lorenzo, I would, to clarify, I do also think that creation starts on Sunday, when light is separated from dark, when the sun separates from the earth, and then the second day would be Monday, when the moon separates.
Okay, sorry,
Yeah.
didn't get the part. Thank you.
Leaf, please.
Yeah, thank you, Matt, for that summary. In the spirit of comparison between Genesis and Steiner's account here, any mention of Genesis invokes for me also I don't know whether to call this as part of a question that I have, whether to call it a recapitulation or a reiteration, just like another way of saying the same thing, but the comparable beginning to the Gospel according to John. And it's in a certain way like what is being recounted. I mean, another interesting question is Genesis 1 compared to Genesis 2, which gives different sequential or diachronic accounts of the unfolding of nature. But then John seems to give not a diachronic account at all, but almost a synchronic account. And the extraordinary thing is we are like in this shared project that we have, we are in a certain way through our ability to well, in Steiner's case, to remember, and in our ability to follow these thoughts and kind of think them synchronically, we are, I mean, in a certain way, taking part in this well, we're also, it's like we're taking in a single like panoramic view these eons of unfolding that happen through time. But we're always able to do that as humans because of the power of memory, where we can gather everything together. I mentioned this before, but logos itself originally came from the word to gather. So anthology is a gathering of flowers. And so in some way, we have like, we're just coming at this from many sides.
Yeah, thanks, Max. Anyone else have thoughts to share? Rosemary, please.
I noticed in paragraph 71, I don't know if I have noticed this in previous readings, but he says that there's a time when, after the fire spirits and have infused the growing humans, then that's the point at which the human forces started to be co-creators. I thought that was pretty significant. And when we get further along, and he's talking about the various Earth epochs and in stages, I think maybe this is covering that, it's beginning to cover that stage where he says, whatever took place upon Earth proceeded still to a large extent from the forces of human beings. An observer looking from beyond the Earth upon the events of nature that were taking place there would not have seen in these mere outer processes, independent of man. He would have recognized in them the influence also of human beings. So those of us who believe in reincarnation are looking forward to future incarnations in which we will be participating more and more consciously with the future evolution of Earth. So in a way, it's here we're looking about the coming in to the participation so that we'll be able to do it in a more conscious way in our future lives.
Can I ask a question? If we imagine thinking away all heat from nature, two things that come to mind that heat does. One is transform substances, and the other is expand them. And is it right to think of heat in this like quintessential sense as basically what would keep an atom open instead of just collapsing on itself?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I can certainly think of that in terms of a star, like the radiation keeps the force of gravity from collapsing the star, right? As
The
for an
reason,
atom, yeah.
well, the reason I've thought of this is because if you watch, like imagine watching the combustion of a piece of wood, for instance, you have something that keeps its volume. So it's almost as though imagine the way you blow into a balloon and it keeps volume in the balloon. But then if you let the air out, then the balloon collapses on itself. Well, it's as though wood, for instance, is probably like one of the most limpid examples of this. It's as though heat and maybe light from the sun has been enchanted into these carbon bonds, almost like a balloon. But if you set it on fire, then the heat goes away and the whole piece of wood just collapses into soot and dust and ashes. And imagine almost like everything around us in nature is kind of filled and replete with heat, but then if the heat escapes, you would see a collapse, just like with the ash.
Yeah, no, I think of like Schelling's philosophy of nature, where every reasonably stable form is a kind of temporary equilibrium between an expansive and contractive force. The expansive would be heat, the contractive would be something more like gravity, I guess. And this seems to be why during the Earth phase that the sun and the moon separate, is to sort of maintain this balance between the expansive force of the sun and the contractive densifying forces of the moon, right? That the Earth has to be held in tension between these two.
And then light seems to be what, in a certain way, like retains a oneness in spite of differentiation. Because I think of like if you think of light according to the physicists, that you've reduced light to, photons, charges basically. There's nothing about the description of a photon that accounts for how light can ferry images, across space. So there's something about light that has to do with a kind of communication almost.
Right. Yeah. No, materialistic physics wants to describe and explain light as if the eye or our consciousness wasn't a factor. It's trying to explain it as though it were some independent particle, which is kind of silly. It becomes quite apparent in the case of light that there's nothing left if you remove consciousness from it. Lorenzo, please.
Yeah, I think that maybe we should compare light and logos. What Max, you were saying before, that logos is togetherness of meaning. I would say it's the undivided meaning, and I think that undivided meaning and light can be equated. For example, if we
Can I add something, Lorenzo?
yeah, please go ahead.
Well, it's very helpful because even like according to theories of relativity, there's something that happens in the case. So we can talk coherently about time and space uh, in in frames of reference that are below the speed of light. But when you like approach and then finally attain the speed of light, then the togetherness that Lorenzo just described totally prevails. And so there's no longer differentiation in terms of space or in terms of sequence.
Yeah, also if we think about meaning and what meaning of the words we use is, we see that each word is each word's meaning derives from some kind of division, because earlier on there was another term, or maybe the same term had another meaning. There were less words, and these words were neither concrete or ideal or abstract, but they had both these aspects together, like wind or spirit. There was just one word to mean both the physical, concrete wind and the metaphysical or ideal spirit. And if one goes back to the to this common ground between words, that's where one is making poetry. I mean, that's when if one is able to give words back that kind of togetherness, then their speech become more evocatory. It assumes physical qualities. It becomes, poetic. You're actually affected by the words, which are not empty anymore, and one can feel images and emotions. And if one looks at what is happening during poetic diction in the poetic function of language, then in that moment it's always a time when we are using the words, the lexicon that already exists, but our use of the lexicon overrides or comes first before the known lexicon. One is like enveloping the lexicon and using it in a new way, or restoring the constituent moment of that lexicon, the time of insurgence of the words. And before there were words, it was just one word, and that's the logos. And if we see what happens with poetry, this kind of evocatory power that brings forth images, we can already see the nature of light. And I think as the closest we approach that original togetherness of meaning, the more it's eidetic, light-like aspect comes forth.
Just to build on what you brought up, Lorenzo, I love the idea that through poetry we're reversing this movement of sort of scattering abroad of language, symbolized by the Tower of Babel. The reversal, or the kind of you described a restoration, a gathering really. The gathering together is something that we were taking in, like you said, whenever we speak in the like more elevated, more poetic diction. And returning to the first comment that you made about like the original, the primal meaning, the primal undivided meaning from which everything, all the differentiations then went forth. I often think of this, or I often try to imaginatively place myself in the condition of a newborn infant. And I think of it by analogy to mitosis, actually, the way one cell then divides into two cells and four cells. It's as though starting from this primordial undivided meaning, the logos, over the course of our cognitive and intellectual development, we're actually recapitulating the same kind of articulation that the gods performed in nature. And so this, again, primal undifferentiated meaning then progressively, by degrees, differentiates into the like familiar words and objects that we encounter in this world. And probably the first divisions are, in a certain way, polarities, heaven and earth, that are described, the very polarities that are described in Genesis, and no other polarities than that.
Yeah, I will just add one thing before Jeff comes in. Yeah, I think maybe the works of Piaget trace something similar to what you were speaking about in thinking about the earliest moment of one's life as closer to the undifferentiated meaning, and he studied the development of dimensionality in our perception. But anyway, yeah, that's just a thought. Thanks.
Very inspiring conversation, is it? um, itself pulls apart and coheres and pulls apart and coheres. I was thinking about, as I was reading this just this morning, coming back through it, I was thinking about, I brought up Plato and Aristotle last time as initiates who are experiencing certain sort of aspects of what he was describing last time, meaning Aristotle's conformity theory and the way in which Plato was seeing the world come forth, seeing that which was the source out of which the shadows were cast. And it occurs to me that in a sense we can find initiates before them, coming sort of the time frame of the evolution of the earth through all of its stages leads to a kind of perception that gets closer and the reality comes closer and closer in our time, but we go backwards in time as relates to the way in which people were initiated into these mysteries. And so I hear Heraclitus in this, because out of the fire, which he deemed the mother, the singular mother, we have the Logos. And he's the first that I'm aware of that speaks of the Logos, right? And then even previous to that, or contemporaneous to that, is Pherecydes and Pythagoras, and they're describing the three mothers and the elements as relates to what Lorenzo was saying, which is that they're both words, they're language, they're languaging, they're expressed, but they're also the thing that's being expressed themselves through an existential process, incarnating as a soul process at that time. And I'm finding that imagery quite powerful, particularly within this conversation. The other thing I wanted to bring is that obviously one of the things Pythagoras was seeing was the way the word resounded. The word was made sound, and we resounded. We were spoken forth, not just sort of semantically or semiotically issued forth, but it was actually through and is through, I would say, the existence of resonant sound or resonance, period. Yeah. And then there's there being the light, of course, being that which is together in coherent languaging. I loved, Lorenzo, that you brought poetry in as a metabolizing, almost making re-inherent that which we've pulled apart through words and language. So I'll add that to that conversation. I would just also like to ask the question, and forgive me, I forget the paragraph number, but there is a statement that he makes, and we don't have to answer it now, but I want to ask it before I forget. And that is that the earth at a time when the sun was separating still had, and this is the term he uses, still had the same surface and interiority that the moon today has. That one was out of the blue to me, and I wonder if anybody can make any sense out of that.
I don't have anything I'd like to just jump in here if I may. Jeff, I don't have anything to add on the very last point you brought up, but I wanted to retrace back to your statement about the word being spoken forth. And I think that's captured very neatly in the dynamic of the Trinity. You have a power, like an agency that resolves to speak. You have the semantic content, the meaning of the word itself. And finally, you have the breath on which it's spoken. And these, I think, correspond very neatly to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Especially in light of Lorenzo's comment that breath is, or that, excuse me, the Latin word for breath is none other than spirit.
I want to talk about the breath in a second, but Jeff's last question reminds me of something Steiner says elsewhere about, Yahweh's presence in the moon reflecting the light of the sun. But that's the physical surface of the moon, and that there's a kind of spiritual interior of the moon where Lucifer hangs out. That's a fiery fortress, like inside. And I don't know if that's what you're thinking there, but there's these two faces of the moon, the visible one and the hidden one, and good and evil seems reflected there. Where there's this Luciferic element in the interior of the moon that's trying to rush things, whereas the surface of the moon is more sort of calmly reflecting the light of the sun, not claiming it as its own in some sense. But in
Always
connection,
on Lucifer's impetuousness.
yes,
Yeah, wet blanket.
right. And in terms of the breath, there's so many wonderful things being said about speech, and I think again of the Genesis account, when Adam's learning to speak and name the animals and plants and whatnot, and that's this gradual interiorization and possession of the capacity to speak that initially is breathed into the human being by Yahweh. And Steiner says that it's 193 in my translation. I'm not sure what paragraph it is. I apologize, but he talks about in the air that streamed into him, man did not altogether feel his own being initially, for in the air the forces of higher beings were at work. Nevertheless, part of the forces and influence within the air that poured through him still remained his own, namely that portion which had already become his own through the etheric forces that he had formerly developed on the sun. Man had therefore a portion of the airy currents under his command, insomuch as this was so, not just the higher beings, but he himself was working at his formation and configuration. He shaped the airy parts within him in accordance with the pictures of his astral body, while the air was streaming into his body from without to become there the foundation of his breathing life. A portion of the air was differentiated off within him into an organism inherent in his own nature. This became the basis of the later nervous system. So there's this aspect of the air being breathed into us by Yahweh, which we don't yet feel as our own, and it seems that this has something to do with the formation of our nervous system. And I couldn't help but think of William Blake here, where he's talking about the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and the tree of life, and the way in which, I forget the exact lines of this, but Blake says, we're searching far and wide for this tree in our environment, and we're never going to find it there because God has hidden it within us. It's our own nervous system. And so I am trying here to interpret. It's interesting how in other lectures Steiner names Yahweh more clearly, whereas in Occult Science he doesn't, at least so far, mention who is this being breathing the air into the human being at this stage. It's like he wants some of this to remain implicit and not give us all of the names of the characters who are engaged in this drama. James, please.
And I think Steiner said once in that Hebrew translation of Genesis, he stated that we always translate as in the beginning, which in the Hebrew yourself, you can probably translate it as in a beginning, which seems like we're always doing in a beginning. I watched your answer to Job. Both of those are very good. And I recommend people to go see that. But you're talking about the Revelations, the 144,000. And I was thinking, well, Genesis and Revelation, Alpha, Omega, it's almost the same thing. That someone's breathing, but it's like a revelation breathing into us. And basically, I think this goes in with all these recapitulations and always building on itself. And that's all I had to say. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, James. I just to say briefly that just by coincidence, a friend of mine suggested that we read Answer to Job together, and we did do these couple of dialogues on YouTube. And I'd read Answer to Job 15 years ago, and I hadn't remembered just how many resonances there are with Steiner's account in Occult Science. I mean, Jung's talking about the book of Job initially, but then he goes through the Old Testament talking about various prophets and their visions of the hierarchies and the fall which occurs in heaven, and it's just striking to see and compare Jung's way of trying to do a kind of anamnesis. Compare that with Steiner's attempt to do a kind of anamnesis, where Steiner is very much trying to read the Akashic record, and yes, you can see correspondences with the biblical text and apocryphal texts and Gnostic texts and so on, whereas Jung is very much staying to the textual evidence, not claiming clairvoyant vision. And I think there's a way in which that makes Jung more limited, but there's another way in which it provides us a helpful contrast, for me at least, to understand two beings, two men who at around the same time were engaged in this effort to see history in a spiritual way and not just in a physical way. Jung's psychological more than spiritual, I suppose. But it's just a really helpful contrast, or was for me at least. So I for those of you who haven't read Answer to Job, I encourage you to check it out. Max, please.
Just very briefly, I wanted to trace a thread of continuity between a comment, Matt, that you made and a comment earlier in this discussion that Rosemary made about, starting with what Rosemary said in respect to the collaboration of human beings in the economy of creation. And to me, the iconic scene in which God leads the animals before Adam and he progressively names them. To me, that indicates actually the beginning of this collaboration that Rosemary alluded to. And then you see it just intensify throughout the Old Testament. Another milestone comes in the form of Noah, when he takes those very animals and basically the new creation after the flood is entirely contingent on the active participation of Noah.
Yeah, please, Karsten.
Yeah, hi. What I want to say might be a bit confused. So it's triggered by the things that were talked about, the concept of logos and also light. And in the chat, I shared a quote from Walter Russell, which is who had some very profound ideas about natural science and spirituality. And one of his ideas was that light is actually stillness. The very essence of light is that it's stillness. And electrical phenomena are motion, basically. And the thing about stillness is that it can only realize itself as stillness, recognize itself as stillness as a contrast to motion. So there's this process of, say, the source of life kind of becoming divided against itself by entering into the world of electrical phenomena, of motion, and then coming back to the realization of this deeper identity with light or stillness. So that was one thing. And the other thing is, I have this book by Karen. I don't know how to pronounce her name. NG. Is that upside down? Yeah. She's called Karen NG, and she's written this book called Hegel's Concept of Life. And the basic idea in this book, first of all, I think it's a book that brings Hegel closer to Schelling than what is normally recognized, in particular in his natural philosophy. And he has this idea about the life as a kind of an idea that it becomes divided against itself, and then has to enter into this process of reunification. And so I think it has something to do with this concept of the logos, and perhaps in the logos there is something about bringing together. But before that, I also think there's something about taking things apart. Also, I think it relates to, say, Goethe's idea about intensification and the striving towards greater perfection and complexity. So we take things apart in general in life to have them to kind of unite them at a higher, more complex, more intense level of being. So there's this quote in this book from the Encyclopedia Logic, I think it's called, by Hegel, where he says, the absolute idea is, first of all, the unity of the theoretical and the practical idea, and hence equally the unity of the idea of life with the idea of cognition. The deficiency of life consists in the fact that it's still only the idea in itself. On the contrary, is the idea only as it is for itself in cognition. As cognition, on the contrary, is the idea only as it is for itself in the same one-sided way. The unity and the truth of these two is the idea that it is in and for itself, and hence absolute. So there's this kind of trope of figure that you see in different places with life. I mean, I think Maxi also talked about this fact about cells, the division of cells. So the organisms start out as one cell that then divides into two, and each division kind of creates the opportunity to create a wholeness on a higher level, more intense, more perfected, so to speak. So I know this is all confused, but because I am confused right now, I'm confused when I read this book. I'm also confused when I hear this dialogue, but I think it's at the same time, I think it's very inspiring. So I just wanted to throw a little more confusion into the picture.
That's funny. May I? That's really funny. Actually, you were very coherent, I would say, and I really appreciate that. I think you added an immense amount to this conversation. And we're all just groping about. Like, none of us can pretend to, like, we're getting this shit, right? It's an amazing experience, and I appreciate every single contribution. I want to just pull in this idea of life because I've been thinking about this, and it appears through this account that there's something before life, right? That life didn't exist as we define life, or as I understand life, or as is commonly understood, or I've ever heard anybody express what they think life is from a biological standpoint, from a biospheric standpoint. And so it occurs to me there must be something that precedes life, let alone something that follows life after life. And it seems like that has to do with this cohesion, this unity. And maybe this is overstating the obvious, but in working with structure phenomenology, I've come to this gripping of the role of metamorphosis as a lawful metabolic process by which we as human beings, as agents inside that process, are born from something immanent and then are now participating in a contribution to that immanence. And so the world we're facing, in a certain sense, is a world that we've been a participant in creating. And I find that kind of extraordinarily beautiful, but also very humbling and very difficult to hold on to. But if you really want confusion added, I just did that myself. So thank you, Karsten.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff and Karsten. Yeah, I was just reading an article yesterday, and there seems to be it's symptomatic of a larger shift in biology that this neo-Darwinian picture of evolution as a mechanical process that involves random genetic mutations that then get passively selected by an environment, that idea is being dismissed and overturned within biology by the next generation of scientists who are recognizing that life is fundamentally a cognitive process, that cells are minded beings, and that the capacity to make decisions and learn is intrinsic to life and has been from the beginning, so that evolution is not just a mechanistic process where organisms have no agency. That it's been the agency of organisms from the very beginning, that selection is intelligent and not just kind of accidental in terms of which organisms happen to survive and reproduce better in an environment. And part of what's going on here also is the realization that organisms are inseparable from their environment. And the concept of an environment makes no sense independent of organisms. And so when we think about what Steiner is doing in this text and the background for him of Haeckel and developmental biology and embryogenesis, we're part of the struggle here is not only to think the human I and our own consciousness as part and parcel and a participant in the process from the beginning, but to think organism and environment, as I've mentioned several times throughout our sessions, as a unity. And so, in other words, like space and time and matter out there in the external world it's not already given and then life evolves within that or upon that stage. You know, everything about the environment is itself a result of a process of differentiation, of living differentiation. And so to think organism and environment with a hyphen as inseparable, I think when we really take that to heart and then try to understand cosmic evolution, things get really weird. The topology of it is totally different than we're used to. Thinking of atoms in the void, right? A pre-existing container of some kind. The idea of any pre-existing container goes away when we think developmentally in this way. I think Hegel and Schelling and their philosophies of nature and life were already suggesting this, and it's taken natural science a few centuries to catch up, but I think it's happening. Karsten, please.
Yeah, I just want to, I saw you had a dialogue with Michael Levin at some point, and he has this beautiful expression that he uses. He's talking about multi-level competency hierarchies in which, for example, biological cells are, he calls them cognitive agents, solving problems in their own problem space. And so this idea that you have, I mean, cells kind of have their own world in which they're cognitive agents solving their problems in their problem space, but thereby contributing to the organs, which in themselves are cognitive agents, as Michael Levin theorizes about it. And they're also solving their problems in their problem space, which then kind of contribute to the whole organism. And in the other direction, the whole organism kind of provides an environment for the organ systems, which in return provides an environment for the cells in which they can live and move and have their being, so to speak. Actually, I'll touch upon these things when I do my presentation of Martinez's ideas, because he has some very similar ideas here. That'll be 8 days from now, I think we've planned that.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Karsten. Next Wednesday, 9 a.m. Pacific, Karsten will be doing a pop-up for us. You can see more about that on Substack. But yeah, this gradual nesting of environments within environments is very much what evolution is all about. Jeff, please. You're muted. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that what Michael's work is pointing to, and others, has been pointed to by others in many, well, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago, in the work of Harold Hoffman and Gilbert Ling, for example, and others. I think Mei-Wan Ho is another person, if I'm correct in that name. And I guess I feel the need to fire a warning shot on that one, because it's not like the medical industrial complex, which is based on so-called biology, is giving up the ghost on this one really quickly. And I would suggest, without adding controversy to this group, that we've just gone through 4 years of idiocy based on an epistemology built in sand as relates to microbiology. So I can't get fast enough toward Michael Levin. The other thing I was going to say is that I think, the thing that Michael's work points to is something I'm not sure he'd be willing to say, which is that there's a world before these. There's Karsten really touched upon it. There's like an anti-space before the incarnation or the emergence of these elements, and that world is perhaps more real than the elements that it is that even Michael is describing. And as the through line is the organizing principle, right, as we know from Riddles of Philosophy and Philosophy of Freedom.
Yeah, I think you're referencing this morphospace, this Platonic morphospace that Levin will discuss as the memory out of which the bioelectric fields draws in order to form the shapes, the morphologies of organisms. And to what extent it pre-exists the organism or is co-evolving with the organism is murky territory. And I think Michael Levin is very cautious. He's such a good scientist, and he's fully willing to engage in speculation with philosophers like me, but he always wants to be able to show his work in the lab. And the thing is, I see him as an example of an American developing this deeper understanding of the etheric and the connection to technology and mechanism and computation, because he very much likes those sorts of metaphors, even though what he's actually describing is not at all like machines. It's kind of an etheric technology that he's beginning to develop, and I see that playing out in his work.
I must leave. Goodbye, everybody. See you in a week.
All right, Lorenzo.
Bye. Ciao.
Take care. Everett, please.
Yeah, real quick, just hearing everybody talk about, Karsten and Jeff about the before of the before. And Steiner talked about that earlier in that section where he was wrapping up on Saturn. And he says that by really exact observation, however, we shall notice that all questions concerning the whence must end at the above described Saturn conditions, because we have come to a sphere in which the beings and processes are no longer justified by their origin, but by themselves. So that's all that I had to add. And that's what came to mind when I heard what Karsten was saying and what Jeff was saying and what you were saying. So
Yeah, thanks, Everett. It's in another lecture, Steiner talks about these why questions that we might ask. I think he gives the example of like a pothole in the road. Like, well, where did that come from? Well, why is that there? It's like, oh, well, a car ran over it and cause that. And I'm like, well, where did that car come from? And it's like, well, it was delivering goods to the store. And like, well, where did that come from? And eventually, these sorts of questions don't lead anywhere. But yeah,
Yeah, that's the section. That's the section that I was quoting from, the very end of that section where he talks about wagon wheel tracks on the road and all the questions that you can ask about it. And at the end, you do come to a place where things are justified by themselves. So I thought that was interesting, and it gives me a lot to think about.
right. The deeds of spiritual beings as a cause is a satisfying resting place for our questioning, is what he seems to be suggesting there. Yeah. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. Next week, we are reading the next 20 pages, which paragraph numbers are, session 11 is paragraph 74 through 93 in chapter 4, or pages 201 to 221 if you're reading from the Adams translation. And then Wednesday next week, Karsten will be doing his pop-up on Martinez. So see you next week, everyone.